in Kingston, New York. Thank you, Kurt. Just one. We need a mic on. That's all right.
Test one, here we go. Our next speaker has been at the forefront of progressive political reform activism for 50 years. His name is synonymous with grassroots reform in the areas of consumer rights, humanitarianism, environmentalism, and democratic government. How about a nice big welcome for Ralph Nader?
Thank you.
I'm going to tune you in. I'm going to tune you in.
Thank you very much. This is a marvelous gathering, a marvelous day, historic Kingston. I'm told it's the most famous intersection in revolutionary times. I can see the stone houses I read about. You know, when you speak outside, you often have to lighten it up. What I want you to do, if you would, please, just assume we're inside, because I'm going to lay it out in a way where you're going to leave, and even if you're not an active citizen, which many of you are, you will leave saying to yourself, I now know what I can do, and I know I can be effective. All right. So I'm going to go through a sequence where we look at what's going on and we basically say, as human beings, if we do not anticipate and forestall, we're not going to make it. Okay? Because the world is full of countries that were very peaceful and they all thought it couldn't happen there. And it did. Again and again, because the mass majority of the people did nothing. While the trouble started on the horizon, the thunderclouds, the lightning, and then violent chaos and disintegration of everything you've ever built and everything you want to do in life. And we see that in the headlines already. We are gathered here to initiate a new burst of energy to wage peace. That's an important phrase, waging peace. To build on the determined work of other war resistors and peace advocates. It's gratifying to see that Gerald Celente and his friends have started it here. And those of you who are from New York City may say, well, why doesn't it start in New York City? And here's my answer. Historically, the greatest movements for justice in the history of our country started from small towns and rural areas. I wonder why. This whole meeting is being videotaped for a larger group of people to listen to and mobilize. One good thing about the internet age is if you establish the model here of peace advocacy, and not just a rally or two, but as part of your daily life, that model will spread to other places around the country because the internet can spread it faster and cheaper than anything we've seen before in communications. So isn't it nice to look at the internet for once as something other than narcissistic gossip and text messaging? It's also important that we build and stand on the shoulders of people who have been at this, waging peace, resisting criminal wars of aggression, resisting the devastation in so many ways of the use of brute force as an instrument of foreign policy that affects our country and our economy and our soldiers in a very devastating manner. These are people that you may not have heard of, or you may be even part of. You may have supported them. The Peace Pilgrim. Have you ever heard of her? Yes. She decided she was going to do something. She had no money. She was not well known, and she was in her 50s, I believe. She walked all over the country more than once, stayed on cots with anybody who would give her a shelter, and she spread the message. She now has people all over the country supporting her. Unfortunately, she was killed by a car that hit her on the highway when she was pilgriming for peace. But they've carried on. She's inspired people. This is their newsletter, Friends of Peace Pilgrim. And one of her closest associates just turned 100. And she's still at it, at 100 years old. Helene Young it is her name. It's in Shelton, Connecticut. Then there's the Women's Strike for Peace. How about that one? The early one. And they stopped the above ground testing. They were really effective in the 1960s and were instrumental in the start of the treaties between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, something they were told was impossible. How can a group of women do this? They don't have any connections. They're not corporations. They don't have lobbyists on Capitol Hill. And then there's the Friends Committee on Legislation, the Quakers. They couldn't reach Richard Nixon, who's a Quaker, but they have been very, very consistent. Physicians for Human Rights, very, very up front on there. SANE, remember SANE? That was started by a few people. Nobody knew their names. They made a difference. As Margaret Mead said, only a few ever changed anything anyway. Less than 1% can turn this country around, and I'll point that out in more detail. Veterans, Iraq Veterans Against War, I've met many of them, and it's too bad. It's too bad that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney didn't meet them. They were cowards even to meet the soldiers coming home, wounded, sick, determined, angry, ready to tell it like it is, and like what they saw in the Bush-Cheney sociocide of Iraq, and over 1 million dead in Iraq, and thousands of U.S. soldiers dead, and tens of thousands sickened. And that society's been completely broken apart, never threatened us. As Ron Paul once said, Bush and Cheney lied us into war. Lied us into war. With the passivity of the Democrats and the complicity of the mass media. You remember how it was those days. And there's Peace Now on the Israeli-Palestine issue. Did you know that Peace Now has more dues-paying members in the United States than AIPAC? That's how fast they're growing. And then there's one of my favorites, Veterans for Peace. Are you here? Okay. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace out of St. Louis, and the materials on Veterans for Peace are on that table out there. And they are tough and right. They're not bamboozled. They experienced it over there, and they say it the way it should be said. And they've got it compressed so you can pick up the handouts there. The Environmental Peace Alliance, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Here's an example. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they did a lot of the work on nuclear bombs and diffuses, and they've contaminated areas around with radioactivity. And there's this little group that has been at it now for 30 years. This is their newsletter. Tell the Bechtel Lockheed. Tell the taxpayer about Bechtel Lockheed. And they're right there where the Oak Ridge National Labs are. And they know what's going on. And they've been working. So you have these local groups all around, and they're marvelous to connect with. They're wonderful people, and you certainly can benefit from from their experience. Have you ever heard of Coleman McCarthy and the peace studies he's put into hundreds of high schools and colleges? He was a Washington Post reporter, and he quit, and he said in one of his books, quote, "I'd rather teach peace," end quote. And he's got peace studies, all in the high schools and colleges. And he asked the question, why are there war academies, all kinds of courses about wars and killings and blowing things up and modern weapons of mass destruction, but most people would rather have peace, right? Okay, and so he's teaching peace, and he shows a lot how peaceful diplomacy's averted throughout modern history. A lot of wars. People think, oh, peace, that's soft stuff. That doesn't do it. And he has examples, and you should see the high school students try to challenge him. What about Hitler? What would you do this and that? You should look at his website. It's Coleman McCarthy. Oh, I don't have it right here. That's all right, I'll get it. Okay, now, so this is the first section of my remarks, so you can see that you can build on this. Now, did you know that the United States and 62 other countries in 1928 signed a treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Treaty to outlaw war as an instrument of national policy? And Germany, Japan, and Italy signed it as well. This is 1928. So war is actually illegal as an instrument of national policy. That doesn't mean if you're attacked, you can't fight back. It means that aggressive war, preemptive war, preventive war, blowing apart other countries that never threatened us, killing millions of people or injuring millions of people because a few threatened us, that's a violation of international law too. You can't blow up a whole apartment building because you have one suspect and all the rest are peacefully sleeping with their families. That's a violation of international law. Now let's get to the wars of aggression here. We have basically presidents who are now prosecutors, judge, jury, executioners, all in secret. That is clearly a violation of our Constitution's separation of powers. Only Congress can declare war, and yet presidents have been declaring wars and mini-wars almost every day now with drones and other instruments of destruction, so they're violating the law. The judges are supposed to have a role, aren't they? They're supposed to restrain the excesses and arbitrary behavior of the legislative and executive branch, right in the Constitution, huh? Okay? They have exempted themselves. They have two wonderful doctrines that say to you, no matter how criminal your government is, no matter how homicidal it is, you cannot sue them in federal court because you, meaning 330 million Americans, have, quote, no legal standing to sue. It's called no legal standing to sue, which is a medieval doctrine inherited from England that has been refined to exclude you from the one branch of government that can bring to account the other two branches. And they say you have no standing to sue, even though you're standing and you're ready to sue, because you don't have enough of a stake. You don't have enough of a stake. The only stake you have is to try to save your country. Try to prevent wars of aggression that are blowing back on this country in ways that you all know and will be made clear in a few minutes. The other technique the judges give you, so they ace themselves out of their constitutional role, is when you sue the government on foreign and military policy, even specific things that they've done, like blowing up a school in Afghanistan after the spotter, who told me personally, and he wrote a book, the spotter on the ground, a U.S. Special Forces man, told the pilots, don't hit that building, it's a school. And the pilots hit the building and blew up the children and the teachers. So something like that, you can't even sue. Who gave them that order? The stuff's coming from button pushers in Virginia and Nevada, if not closer to the White House. They say it's a political question. It's just a political question. It's got to be resolved not by the courts, but by Congress and the White House. But dear Judge, they're not resolving it. They continue to kill. They're recidivists. Too bad. The courts have nothing to do with it. Can't help you. Well, that's what we're here to confront. Here's what happens when we have wars of aggression that are not declared by Congress. Why do you think the Founding Fathers, why do you think they put the exclusive power to declare war in the Congress? Not in the White House and nowhere else. Because they didn't want another King George in the name of a president plunging our country into war on his say-so. They wanted a deliberative process in Congress, hearings, etc. That is not what has been happening. Congress has surrendered its congressional authority, and it has given it to the White House carte blanche. And the White House has taken it enthusiastically. Have you heard about Killer Tuesday? The New York Times, about 2-3 years ago, front page, unchallenged, reported, based on interviews in and around the Obama administration, that every Tuesday, President Obama gathers his security advisors in the White House, and they decide who's going to live and who's going to die in Yemen or Somalia or Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or you name it. Drones. And President Obama gives the thumbs up, thumbs down. Who authorized him to do that? Where's the imminent peril requirement? And what happens when they expand it? You see, when they're not stopped. First it was, oh, there's suspects in some car on a sandy road in Yemen. Take it out. Bingo. Well, now they don't even have suspects. They're so-called signature strikes. Signature strikes mean when they see 6 or 7 young men in Yemen or Somalia or elsewhere just standing around on a road, maybe near a vehicle, they're considered targets. Vaporize them. Now, apart from the brutal homicide that's involved here, apart from the criminality, you think that's a smart move from our own national security? No. When you blow up 14 schoolboys on a hill in Afghanistan who are collecting firewood for their parents, when you blow up wedding processions with all our precision equipment, what do you think happens? They get more angry. They mobilize. They join the Taliban. They join ISIS. That's what happens. What do you think we would do if we had drones attacking us in New York and Illinois and Iowa and Texas? What do you think we would do if our president was overthrown by some foreign intelligence agency abroad, as we overthrew the prime minister of Iran in 1953, whose only sin was he wanted to take control of the country's oil resources from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company? What do you think we would feel like if some giant power, 50 times more powerful, invaded us, overthrew our government, and occupied us, and started pushing us all around? Huh? You think we'd be playing tiddlywinks? You think we'd be watching entertainment TV? We'd be doing even more, by far, than the resistors are doing over there. When we and the British and the French, for over 100 years, carve up these areas into phony boundaries for countries, cross against tribal territories, entrenched dictatorships, armed dictatorships that brutalize their own people, exploit their resources, such as oil, push them around, then you wonder why they don't love us? You wonder why they resent us? You wonder why they resist us? Put the shoe on the other foot, American people, and you'll see what you would do if you were treated this way. Look at the costs. Look at the costs. All empires eventually devour themselves. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Soviet Empire, they all devour themselves. Why? Because they expend more and more resources pushing people and killing people around the world than they do to expend resources for their own people and for their own economies and for their own jobs and for their own public works and for their own health insurance and for their own mass transit. And our country has bled because of what Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex. That was in his farewell address. You know, he knew a little bit about war. And he said, watch out for the military-industrial complex, 1961. He said, watch out, not just for what it's going to cost our tax dollars, but he added what it's going to cost our freedoms. Was he ever prophetic? Because enough is never enough for Lockheed Martin. Enough is never enough for General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing, Grumman. You ask them, hey, you've already produced enough weapons, you companies, in the last 50 years to blow up the world 300 times and make the rubble bounce. That's the estimate of an industrial engineering professor at Columbia University. How much more do you want to sell the taxpayer? How many more submarines do we need? How many more bombers? How many more missiles? Well, the answer that these company executives give to themselves in private, you know what it is? The answer is the American people don't have any idea how much weaponry they have paid for. And let me give you an example. How many of you have heard of the Trident nuclear submarine? Okay? In 35 minutes, once the launch occurs, how many cities around the world will be incinerated by one Trident submarine? 200. Multiple warheads, MIRVs. One Trident submarine. Enough is never enough for these corrupt, greedy corporate executives and their compensation packages. These are not patriots the way they tell you in ads showing the workers, we're preserving your freedom. They're running the United States of America into the ground because of their corporate greed and their power over Washington, D.C. The war on terrorism is absorbing far, far more resources than the peaceful programs to rebuild the United States of America. It's sewage and water systems, it's public transit, it's highways, it's bridges, it's libraries, renovating its rundown schools. And what are we getting for this war on terrorism? Huge profits. It's big business. War on terrorism is big business. It's got all kinds of companies, all kinds of technology, all kinds of surveillance. It takes a lot of money to snoop on all the American people by the NSA. It takes a lot of money to build the whole infrastructure of weapons of death and destruction. It takes a lot of money to waste and corrupt and overcharge the U.S. government for these weapons. So, let's pause a moment. What did we get for it since 2001? What did we get for it? Well, it started out with a criminal gang in northeast Afghanistan. I don't think they were estimated to be more than 50. So instead of going after the criminal gang with a multilateral pursuit, not only the U.S. but other countries, because they were very sad about 9/11, we had a lot of goodwill, we blew apart Afghanistan. We blew apart a country. It's sort of like the father who says, "Quick, the hammer, there's a fly on baby's head." And you know what happened there. You know all the U.S. soldiers who died, who came back, post-traumatic syndrome, sick, families broken up, small businesses had to close. But you also know the devastation on the people of Afghanistan, who had nothing to do with this, going about their business, trying to eke out a living. And who are the ones who attacked on 9/11? Besides, how in the world didn't we get our planes in the air that day, you know? How? Why didn't the FBI listen to its people back there? There's a big story to be told. But here's what we got for our trillions of dollars. We now have tens of thousands of fighters against us. They're not just in northeast Afghanistan. They're in Afghanistan. They're in Pakistan. They're in Yemen. They're in Somalia. They're in Algeria. They're in Libya. They're in Iraq. They're in Syria. They're everywhere, spreading. That's what we get. It's called blowback by the CIA. And you can call it boomerang. It's boomeranging on us. We're creating and expanding the very thing we're fighting. Because we're not fighting it right. We're fighting it with brute force. We don't understand the people there. We don't understand their cultures. We don't understand their fears. We're insensitive to when we blow up their children. And our foreign policy has been one of brute force. It's been one where the first reaction is blow them up. And what's happening is, you now have more than tens of thousands of fighters. They're recruiting in Europe. They're recruiting all over the world. And they're getting more trained. They're getting smarter with weapons. They're getting better with the internet. We're training the very opposition. Now how could our leaders be this stupid? For two reasons. Profiteering is supreme. Very short-sighted. Profiteering, quick gratification. Hey, we blew up a truck with suspects. Very short-sighted. We don't pay our political leaders to have the myopia of a parsimonian, of a microbe, suffocating under its own exudations. We pay them for foresight. We don't pay them for a cheap campaign contribution or a big paying job when they quit the government in Lockheed Martin or General Electric. The second reason for this stupidity is rather obvious. They have no risk. Remember the saying in the 60s on the Vietnam War? If you're not part of the risk, you're not part of the solution. Members of Congress don't have any children in the armed forces, with one or two exceptions. You know, George W. Bush said Iraq was worth it. Well, hey, what about his two girls? Why didn't they sign up? Why didn't they go in the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines? They were age qualified. We have a political ruling class that wants poor whites, poor blacks, and poor Hispanics to go over there and do the dirty work for them because they can't find jobs here. Take those trillions of dollars and put them back in the U.S. Here's the kind of country we'll live in over the last 40 years. No one will die in the U.S. because they can't have health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. That's what Bernie Sanders said. Full Medicare for everybody, everybody in, nobody out. and free choice of doctor and hospital, which we don't have under the corporate system today. Here's what we'd have with those trillions of dollars. No tuition paid, free higher education, just the way it is in Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, you name it, they do it. We won World War II, they were devastated. How come they have it? Because they mobilized. They had stronger trade unions, they had powerful cooperatives, and they went to work. They had higher expectations. How many of you remember the great leader in your history books, Eugene Debs? Right? Okay. At the end of his career, he said he was walking at a demonstration, and a reporter came up to him. Mr. Debs, you've been at this for 50 years. Nobody has discouraged you. What's your greatest regret? And Mr. Debs said, looking at him, he said, my greatest regret, young man, my greatest regret, this is in the 1920s, my greatest regret is that the American people, under their Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want much of anything at all. Raise our expectations. That's the first step toward a just democracy. What else would those trillions of dollars have paid for? They would have raised the wages of tens of millions of Americans who can't put food on the table because of a frozen minimum wage. They would have provided repairs and good-paying jobs that can't be exported to China, to rebuild our infrastructure, our public facilities in every town, village, city. It's crumbling. You see it's crumbling. Look at our schools. We got glittering gambling casinos and crumbling schools because we're an empire. The money's going over there. The money's going into the military budget. Half of our federal budget, aside from Medicare and Medicaid, half of the budget is military. We don't have the Soviet Union anymore. We don't have communist China threatening us. They want our business, our jobs, our industries, and we're obliging them. They're happy. That's what we have to do, raise our expectation level. And to do that, we have to have our own self-respect as citizens. We cannot go around making excuses for ourselves. Here's the ones we've all heard, right? You call up people, hey, you know, there's something going on in Kingston, and can you show up for the city council meeting? Can you go to a rally? Can you join a demonstration in New York City against the war? Well, I agree with you, but I just don't have time. I really don't have time. Well, if you don't have time for democracy, you're going to be very busy with your misery. That's what happens. And so here's an interesting story that relates to all of us. The former head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a publicly owned electric generating distribution system in Tennessee Valley. It was a great godsend to them in the 30s because they had no electricity. Millions of poor people. And the head of it resigned in the 1930s. His name was Arthur Morgan. Why did he resign? Because he wanted to go all over the world to answer the question, what does it take to make social change? What does it take to advance social justice? And he went everywhere. He went to South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, everywhere. And he came back with his answer. And his answer was the title of his little book that came out in 1940. And the answer was The Small Community. Everything starts with the small community. Everything starts with the living room session. Everything starts with two people replacing small talk with big talk. So when you meet someone, the usual is, hi, how are you? Good, even though you're lying, like you got the flu. You okay? Yeah. How are things? Okay. How about a new salutation? Next time you meet people, you say, "Hi, how's your civic life?" Watch their reaction. Huh? Well, starts a conversation, right? Once, 2, 4, 8, 16, 20, things start, then they spread. That's how the peace movement started in the 1960s. That's how the new one started in the 1980s by Fosberg out of Boston. They changed things. Now, as we speak, there are Russian nuclear weapon inspectors in the U.S. looking over in effect, the destruction of nuclear warheads, and U.S. inspectors in Russia observing the destruction of nuclear warheads in Russia. And we have, in effect, disabled half of the missiles that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had ready to go after each other. Now, that wouldn't have happened without small communities. It didn't happen in Congress. It didn't happen in the White House. When Ronald Reagan looked on the evening TV and he saw the huge rallies in New York City, he turned to one of his aides and he says, "Wow, that looked like some pretty well-dressed Republicans there." It changed the government. It doesn't take that much. It's easier than you think. It's easier than you think, and we've proved it again and again. American history has been changed by less than 1% of seriously engaged citizens representing silent majority public opinion. Those are the two things you need. Those are the two things you need. Now here, I've never done this before. I've never asked people to repeat something. But I gotta have you do this for me. Indulge me. It's easier than we think to turn the country around. Let's hear it. It's easier than we think to turn the country around. We did it with less than 1/10 of 1% for the auto industry. Others in the environmental groups got the Air and Water Pollution Control Act. There wasn't more than 50,000 seriously engaged people working on their members of Congress. There are only 535 members of Congress. They put their shoes on every day the way you and I do. There are 1,500 or so companies who spend a lot of time on Congress to get their way with a majority of Congress. How many of us are doing that? Almost none. So if you're fielding your football team against Notre Dame, and Notre Dame comes on with 11 players, and you come on with one player leaning on a cane, who's going to win? Okay, that's the scene in America today. We have given up on ourselves before we have even started to struggle, with very, very few exceptions. Now here's what I'd like you to do. A very simple bill can stop most of the wars that we get into, criminal wars of aggression. Here's the bill. Anytime Congress or the White House is ready to plunge our country into war, the moment that decision is made, every able-bodied, age-qualified child and grandchild of every member of Congress will immediately be drafted into the armed services. That will, shall we say, induce deliberation by our political leaders, won't it? They will decide to have hearings where all kinds of opinions are expressed, including by the retired military that often represents some of the best peace advocates. They will return your calls. they will decide to give interviews other than warmongering. Yeah, send the poor folk over there to do the killing. It's not us. It will work like magic. And they're going to fight that bill, even though it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. But what a wonderful fight to have, huh? Imagine them coming back for the town meetings. Okay, are you for H.R. 5? H.R. 5, H.R. 5. You go nowhere without voting for H.R. 5. We'll be very happy to work on the specific drafting so there are no loopholes to that congressional draft. Okay? That is what gets people talking. Because most people have a sense of fair play, don't they? They may be conservative, liberal, so on. They have a sense of fair play. They can be conservative, liberal. Someone comes around, pushes an older people in the middle of the road to go to the cross. That's not right. It's deep in us. And once we have this kind of bill, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. The second thing we should do is to ask ourselves, what are all these wars of aggression doing to them overseas? They're real people too. They have children too. Pictures are not enough. What is it doing to them? And it's being done to them in our name. That violence is being done to them in our name, as Cindy Sheehan has pointed out, all over the country. It's being done in our name. We should take it personally and reject it, unless we consent to it in a national referendum. Then I mentioned what it's doing to us. Look at our civil liberties. How many people you know don't speak up because they're afraid there'll be some computer file? They don't have to be afraid anymore. We're all in the computer file now. The NSA has dragnet snooped everybody. Emails, telephone numbers. They say that they're not using it. They say it's all in the computer bank. Well, that's really comforting, isn't it? The minute you speak out, then they start using it. The minute you demonstrate, they start using it. But the more there is of us, the less it means anything. They can use it all they want. As long as they get more and more Americans say, you're not going to snoop on us anymore. You're not going to invade our privacy. You're not going to inhibit our freedoms and our liberty. Empire destroys freedom and liberty. Never allow these war hawks to say that they're sending soldiers over there to protect our freedoms. They're sending soldiers over there in a criminal war to kill and die. That's what they're sending soldiers over there, and blow back against our freedoms. That is why we need to talk to the returning veterans, not just the ones that have stood up, Veterans for Peace, Iraq veterans against the war, but the ones who've seen horrible things and are traumatized. You know all the soldiers who are traumatized, people think, well, that's because of the artillery shells and the bombs. Well, the other side, they don't have any artillery shells and fighter planes or naval missiles. They've got suicide belts and Kalashnikovs and maybe some propelled grenades. You know why a lot of these soldiers are under traumatic stress syndrome? It's amazing how few people know that. It's moral stress syndrome. They have been ordered to kill innocent people and families. And it's on their minds all the time. And the psychologists in the military have demonstrated that it is morally induced more than not. Okay, now we've got two other things. We got to join the arms control movement. The Congress, the warmongering Congress, especially the Republicans, who I think are institutionally insane. I think by any criteria. Congress, we got to develop this concept of institutional insanity. Like I've often said, General Motors refused to toilet train itself for 50 years, choking our lungs with pollution, institutionally insane. You know those drug companies who push pregnant women through hospitals, deliver their babies, they want them out in 30 hours? Attention deficit disorder. Yeah, these hospitals have a mental problem. Well, we've got a institutionally insane series of behavior by our government, and they have to be shaken up by a sane citizenship. And we definitely have got to join the existing arms control movements to speed up the enforcement of the treaties that already exist between the U.S. and and Russia now, and the international arms control treaties of long standing. They need to be implemented. Final thing I think you'll all agree with. We need a special independent tribunal by the Justice Department to prosecute the war criminals, starting with George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. You'll notice there are some great full-page ads in the New York Times by the World Can't Wait group. Isn't that a great group? Yes. Those are very powerful and incisive advertisements. We had the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials against the Nazi leaders, where the prosecution was run by Supreme Court Justice on leave, Justice Jackson. And what he said in his opening statement, mind you, there are 20 Nazi criminals in the dock, and the tribunal judges, Nuremberg, Germany, just think we could have immediately executed them. We wanted to establish international law that it is not an excuse to slaughter thousands and millions of innocent people because they gave you an order. Because they didn't follow orders. And what he said was, the precedents coming out of this Nuremberg War Tribunal is going to apply to everybody in the world, including us. That's what he said. And what we've got to do is stop saying to the International Criminal Court, hey, go after those African dictators, but don't go after white dictators or Western dictators, and prosecute them in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And so the important thing here is to follow your conscience. Do not go for the least or the worst of the candidates. Don't be fact-deprived, as this gentleman elaborated so well with his comment just now, that we all have a right, equal right to run for election, local, state, and national, that we don't have an obligation to elect warmongering Republicans or warmongering Democrats, whether they are named Clinton or other warmongering leaders, presumed leaders. And that holds true for members of Congress and your own state legislature. If you don't vote for who do you believe in, who are you going to vote for? The least of the worst, the lesser of two evils, are still evil. And you then strengthen them, lose your bargaining power over them, and enable them to become even worse because they know they have you in their back pocket with the least worst voting attitude.
Talk about Bernie, Ralph. What about Bernie?
Now,
say something about Bernie.
Now, there's a lot to say, and there are others who have said it. Now, there are two little pithy statements that we should all keep with us. One was out of the 14th century China. The Ming Dynasty, a philosopher, said the following: to know and not to do is not to know. So we have the moral imperative of what we know that should be done, but how well do we know it if we don't move into action? To know and not to do is not to know. 14th century. I wonder how he thought of that without the internet, without email. The other definition is one of real vintage, over 2,000 years ago. Marcus Cicero, an ancient Rome leader, elected figure. He said this: you know how many times right-wing politicians throw liberty and freedom in your face Do you ever hear him talk justice, by the way? I once had the task to read all of Ronald Reagan's presidential speeches, talk about masochism. He mentioned freedom and liberty dozens and dozens of times, never mentioned justice. Without justice, there's no freedom and liberty. Justice means bringing down the top 1%, holding them accountable. Justice means people receiving the wealth they've worked for and not having it sucked up to the top 1%. And here is his definition of freedom. These people are very pithy, even though they didn't live in a soundbark TV period. Marcus Cicero said the following, quote, "Freedom is participation in power," end quote. That's the definition of freedom that we should operate on always. The voice of the people, by and for the people in reality. Less than 1% of the people engaged 200 to 400 hours a year, spread out over the year, starting full-time groups in each congressional district. Less than 1% of the people, say 250,000 people, out of 330 million, no big deal. You know how many watched the Super Bowl? Can turn this country around on the issues of peace and war and peace. And that should give us great optimism and great heart. And those 250,000 people reflecting the silent majority out there, they were against the Iraq War, even though they were propagandized by both parties and the media. Can you imagine that? Came in over 50%. They knew what was going on. And if they were more informed, more would have joined that 50+%. You know what makes up those 250,000 people? You in small communities. You in small networked communities in every congressional district. 9 months before the criminal invasion of Iraq. By the way, Saddam Hussein was our anti-communist ally. You know, we propped him up, urged him to invade Iran, 500,000 dead Iranians, gave him equipment, gave him the materials that he made chemical warfare with. So when we invaded Iraq, Bush and Cheney, 9 months, 6 months, 3 months, I counted 300 retired generals, admirals, retired national security officials, and diplomats all spoke out again and again against this criminal war that was pending. They were people like Admiral Shanahan, retired, former head of the Pacific Fleet. They were Marine General Anthony Zinni, Middle East expert against the war, warned against it, said most people in the U.S. Army and the Pentagon agreed with him, but they were muzzled. Imagine that. Most people in the U.S. Army opposed Bush Cheney, but they were muzzled. Then there was James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, the two key national security aides to George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush. They had op-eds, don't invade Iraq, it's going to be a disaster. Then we had the four-star general, head of the National Security Agency, Howard Odom. This is going to be the biggest blunder in American history. Don't do it. And then the mass media ignored them. They had no secretariat, no infrastructure, no full-time people getting them on the media, mobilizing them, going them to 600, 800, 1,200, 1,500, unstoppable. George Soros opposed the war. He opposed it publicly. He opposed it repeatedly. Somehow, he didn't put $100 or $200 million to back up those 300 retired diplomats, national security specialists, and military admirals and generals. Had he done that, we would have got him up to Congress, the media would have been challenged, and the lies of Bush and Cheney about weapons of mass destruction held by Saddam Hussein, about Saddam Hussein sending drones over the Atlantic, all the lies would have been exposed. When you go on national TV and you're a 4-star general in the Marines and you're head of the National Security Agency and you call them out on national TV backed by this secretariat, you think Bush and Cheney wouldn't melt it away with their lies? We could have stopped the war, stopped the consequences, stopped the trillions of dollars, stopped the spread of violence and chaos, stopped the spread of what is coming to this country, not only in destroying our tax base and budgets, not only destroying the soldiers who come back from over there, it's coming here because we're training and expanding our opponents over there. We got to get out of their backyard. We got to stop propping dictatorships up that slice them up and oppress them with U.S. tax dollars and U.S. military. And that doesn't just go for the Arab governments, it goes for the Israeli military juggernaut as well. One of the best spectacles you'll ever see are Israelis and Palestinians in nonviolent demonstrations on the West Bank Israeli border. That is a perfect symbol up against the soldiers and the batons and everything, locking in arms as they do with unified humanity. That's what counts, that kind of moral courage. My last request is this. I brought this book called The Crimes of War. It's 30 people who specialize in wars that violate international law, Geneva Conventions, U.S. Constitution, federal statutes. Cindy Sheehan is in this book. Howard Zinn is in this book. Richard Falk is in this book. You got to go away with this guidebook. This is a book that will convince your friends and relatives who are serious, co-workers, neighbors. This is the book for the discussion in the living rooms to create the small communities that will be networked to triumph. To triumph. Let us not, our generation, be viewed by successive generations as unwilling to exert a little effort in order to achieve a great peace. They're down there on the table. I hope you'll pick them up. And I hope when you go back home, you will double, triple your numbers and see each of you as your own epicenter of activity. And say to your friends and neighbors, there's always time for fun, there's always time for entertainment, but if we don't provide serious time to shape the future of our country and its influence around the world, we will neither have fun nor entertainment, nor be able to raise our families. Thank you very much.
All right, we have one more very powerful speaker for you. Before I introduce him,